Hi, everyone. Good morning. It's Wednesday. It's morning for me in Oregon, USA. Wednesday, December 14th. It's evening for some other folks on the other side of the world. Welcome to our new, as of now, weekly discussion about managed Kubernetes and Cluster API. Cluster API is a subproject of SIG Cluster Lifecycle. We abide by the CNCF Code of Conduct. So we look forward to being kind to one another, and let's get started. So this should be fairly quick today, at least as far as my side is concerned. If other folks want to talk about things in more detail, that's great as well. I don't see any new attendees, so I think we can get started. And I've added one agenda item just to update folks on the managed Kubernetes CapZ stories, saga, whatever you want to call it. So I'm going to paste a link to a PR that we are tracking for graduation from experimental. So I can't recall if Kappa, or in that case, if CapG or the Oracle provider has done what Azure has done, which is to put the managed cluster features behind a feature flag and put it in an area of the code base that is classified as experimental, and have sort of like documented that as such. So this is a PR that I've been curating and that lots of folks have been commenting on over, in fact, several months at this point, which sort of outlines some of the background there and defines criteria for graduating this from experimental. So I just wanted to update this crew on that status, which is that we are nearing consensus on the criteria, and the criteria basically will allow us to graduate after burning down a few final tasks, primarily adding some additional end-to-end coverage. And we anticipate that that will happen in January, so call it Q1 2013. So I'm not sure if we're following any kind of official definition of experimental. What we are calling experimental simply is communicating to our user community that the API surface area may change with any given release at any time. So by graduating from experimental, we are declaring that that won't be the case. Does anybody have any questions about any of that background? Cool. So what this means for this group, in terms of Azure's role in this whole effort, is that we will, as we discuss in this feature group, how we can move a more common cluster API idiomatic managed Kubernetes solution to reality, that for CapZ this would be a V2, because we're essentially going to ship what we have now, which is input for the problem we're trying to solve long term, as this is V1 beta 1, and I don't think that we would introduce a breaking change as a kind of V1 beta 2 kind of thing, or even a V1. I think that would have to be a V2 if I understand that. I can do some more homework in terms of Kubernetes. I think we'd want to just follow the conventions, but my experience suggests that that would be a V2. So I was curious if there's any concerns from the larger group about affinity between a CAPI managed Kubernetes surface area and then like the provider adoption of that. Is a V2 going to be super weird? Is there any concern that CapZ is going to be committed to not breaking this, option 2 flavor of managed Kubernetes in our provider code base for the long term? Any concerns about any of this? Or does this sound like a sort of overly structured official way of what's already happening across other providers? So I just wanted to see if any folks have any comments on that. Go ahead, Richard.
This is sort of what we did with Kappa, I guess, but in a more formal way. We were more like, oh, there's a number of people using it. We feel it's of a certain level of quality. One of those being the end-to-end tests being there. So then we graduated it and moved out of experimental. The feature flag was true by default from that point onwards as well. I guess any caveat for us in relation to what we're talking about is then it just becomes harder to change the API, doesn't it, in the future, which is relevant to these discussions. But yeah, if you follow the deprecation policy, that's not a problem. But yeah, exactly what we did.
Yeah, okay,
It's
cool.
great.
That's exactly what we plan to follow. Basically, I've done this in Kubernetes, upstream Kubernetes with various features, and I'm just going to copy that. And I think it's totally appropriate to do so. So default feature flag to true, announce deprecation, and number of releases, remove feature flag altogether, that kind of thing. Are you in V1 beta 1? Is that Kappa's sort of API version metadata?
We are on V1 beta 2
beta
because
2.
we made some breaking changes for our V2 release that we needed to bump the API version, so we had the conversions and stuff like that.
Cool. So do we have any idea about, so I'm going to type this down so V1 beta 1 or 2 or V1 beta and I'll just call this can we do something like this to V1 beta? Is this a thing we can do? There's a question mark there, or does it have to be more like V1 whatever to V2? That's really my question. And then my follow-up question would be, if we answer that in terms of what we're planning to propose. So if this feature group succeeds in producing an actual concrete proposal within Cluster API, for folks like Kappa and CapZ to adopt that, are we able to adopt that in an API idiomatic fashion in this kind of way? Or does it have to be a rev to the, say, major release? Does it have to be a V2? And then
so the way,
go ahead.
So the way I understand it from when we looked at this in Kappa was we can do that as part of the first one. So as long as we're incrementing V1 beta 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that is possible. I think when we looked at it, it was like, well, you have to keep the features there for 3 versions or 9 months or whatever it was. I can't remember at the time. So that would be then like V1 beta 4 or something like that. I can't.
Got it. Winnie, does that sound like does that agree with your understanding as well, or is this not something you've thought about? That's totally fair as well.
Yeah. What Richard said, that's what I did, and yeah. I think we just like need to know the deprecation timeline and things like that.
We call this V next or something with a breaking API change. But we do have to support legacy API for some period of time. I will do that because we want a definition of that. Okay. John, I'm curious of your thoughts. Does anything sound like we need further follow-up, controversial, or is this what you would expect us to conclude based on your experience working in upstream Kubernetes?
This all seems fairly consistent to me with my understanding of things. So yeah, I think this sounds good.
Cool. To be clear, my main concern with this isn't that I'm not particularly afraid of going from, say, V1 to V2. It's more, I would anticipate, based on my knowledge of the current cluster API, that a managed Kubernetes set of CRD definitions would probably ship as a V1 in cluster API. And so I was concerned that if we have something like V2 and Kappa that is an implementation of V1 and Kappa, that might be wrong. There might be something wrong there. So it sounds like we have enough flexibility where if we want to adhere to the same version that we inherit from Kappa, we can do that. Even if we launch this with Kappa as V2, I don't know how we would do that. But if for whatever reason there's a good reason to do that, it sounds like we can just jump to V2 in the providers as well. So cool. I'll do some homework on this, and this will be part of the proposal doc. On these items. And then I just wanted to, I'll add one more quick agenda item, which is, are we ready to start? So I would vote, before we even answer this question, I want to disclaim this by saying, I think we should do this in January, or at least we should plan to present an initial draft in January. But do folks think that we have, yeah, basically it's like what kind of working agreement do we want to have going forward? Do we want to spend a few of these meetings sort of deliberately teasing out what the problem statements are, ensuring that we reach out to the right number of people as a precondition to actually writing things down on paper? Or do we want to just start writing down on paper and looping people in and having the document be sort of an equivalent discussion medium as these meetings in terms of moving that process forward? Does anybody have any thoughts? Richard's bobbing and weaving. In my experience, the idiomatic thing in Kubernetes is the second one. Most proposals just, if there's an opportunity where folks have cycles and, insights, then things just start going on paper. And then at some point it's shared and it's not super formal. There aren't like formal requirements like thou shalt not begin a proposal doc until you have blah, 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 blah. Go ahead, Winnie.
Yeah, so clarifying question. So
Please.
is the design or the proposal having a CRD in CAPI itself? Is that the scope of this proposal?
Yeah, I think let me see if I can quickly go over to Cluster API. So let me pull up the PR that I have for this feature group, and the scope is stated here. So this would be a good opportunity to sort of like sanity check the scope. So ensure current inconsistencies in managed Kubernetes implementations across providers are well documented. Agree upon a path forward to achieve provider consistency for managed Kubernetes and Cluster API. So to a certain extent, the idea of writing the proposal skips ahead of the part where we talk about, is it a good idea to write a proposal or a good idea to put this into Cluster API? So we could spend a couple of meetings just really clarifying all of our thoughts about, is there an alternative way to achieve consistency without baking this into Cluster API? I mean, of course, we have to accept that Cluster API as a broader community might not agree with our conclusions, but I think we should come into that conversation feeling very confident and strong. And so maybe we need more pros and cons just about like, what if we just did something to the effect that Winnie, you and Richard already did, and let's reevaluate that option 3 or something like that. Maybe that's better than making this into Cluster API, especially if the timelines are moved off. Like maybe we would prefer that kind of standardization. The immediate con that comes to my mind if we're talking about this is just that it's sort of non-binding at that point. It's just a document. The advantage of baking the standardization into the API itself is it's somewhat contractual. Like the provider ecosystem can't help but produce an implementation that meets these goals. Does that make sense what I'm saying? So anyway, in terms of the previous conversation, do we feel like we want to keep talking about that pros and cons, or do we feel like we want to talk about that in a Google Doc and asynchronously over the coming months?
Yeah,
go
so
ahead,
coming
Richard.
back.
Oh, go ahead, Winnie. Sorry, finish your thoughts.
Yeah, question. Yeah, I think we should just like start writing Google Doc. Because yeah, for example, like having the API in Cluster API itself, I get the idea, but it's not really clear to me. So unless like we start like writing it, it doesn't become very clear. So yeah, that's my opinion.
Totally understood. Yes, the sooner we write the doc, the sooner we can get past the phase where Jack Francis is waving his hands in meetings and talking about pie in the sky ideas. Go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, I sort of agree that, yeah, if we start writing the doc, and it gives us something focused to talk about in the meetings that happen every week, and then that feeds back into the doc, and it's a nice cycle of discussion. Yeah, and I also like the idea that we compare multiple options again. You know, can we do it with the current thing? Do we need to create a new API type? Do we need these changes? But yeah, all of that in the doc would be fantastic that we can discuss in person.
Okay, cool. That works for me too. I think it's a personal thing. Personally, the discovery process happening at the same time as the writing stuff down that's how my brain works. That's how I know what I think about things. But glad to have that conversation. I noticed that Nawaz and Akinlolu joined. Welcome. Feel free to raise hands, and I'll give you the floor if you want to comment on anything we're talking about. Okay, cool. I'm glad we talked about that briefly. I think I would suggest that we meet in 2023 at this point, and I mean, that's anything's proposal, if anything's subject to change. If there's anything interesting that comes up, let's self-organize in a practical way. We've got this slot. I think it's fairly durable at this point. We've got the CAPI Zoom, so that's great. I'd be happy to just say race to whoever creates the Google Doc first. You know, you win. That becomes the doc. So if anybody feels motivated and has cycles between now and 3 or 4 weeks from now, and there's a doc that materializes, then that's amazing. So I would encourage anyone to go ahead and do that. And then, of course, it's going to become it'll become a community effort in that document. But I know we're all busy, and this is all like bonus gravy effort. So, Richard, if you have the cycles to do it, or John, or anyone in here, that's great.
Yeah, cool.
Okay. Does anyone else have anything else to bring up?
Yeah, another interesting thing that came up today when I was working on the CapG GKE implementation was it's just a stupid annoyance, which is it's like for the GKE implementation, it's a bit like what we have with Kappa. We want a control plane provider, but we don't want it to be installable separately as a control plane, and then it's API groups and things like this and structure repos. So I guess we never got to that guidance, I guess, for provider implementers. It was more about just API, what should it look like, but not actually how you can structure things as well. So I'm wondering if we could include that as part, or would that be like a separate thing when we update the provider implementers guide?
No, I mean, that doesn't sound like it would be out of scope at all. So it sounds like what you're saying is that in addition to doing the more sort of abstract work of like designing an API that's going to go into cluster API, we should also scope some sort of concrete. I mean, maybe we can almost scope can we do like a novel provider, which is just literally a reference implementation? I don't know if we can do that easily. I don't know how we would do that easily without a particular cloud, and then it's going to become even when we standardize, it's going to be slightly idiomatic from Amazon to Azure to Google. But I think that's great. I don't think that's out of scope at all. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, we get to choose when we stop calling ourselves a feature group. So if we're here 3 years from now and the scope is expanded because we still find value in hanging out, then that's awesome.
Cool, fantastic.
Cool. Any final thoughts? 5 minutes back. Thanks so much, everybody, for this extra 25 minutes of your time, because I know today's a lot of meetings, especially if you're in your evening already. So see some of you in 35 minutes.
Cool. See ya.
Okay.
Bye.